The first time Dan Zephyr woke up on an alien medical table, he was upside down, strapped at the ankles, and mildly irritated. "Can someone explain why I'm hanging like a bat?" he asked, his voice echoing through the sterile chamber. "I didn't sign up for an intergalactic chiropractic appointment." A tall, pale blue alien stepped into view, wearing what Dan guessed was a lab coat, though it shimmered like oil in sunlight. The being's elongated head tilted slightly as it approached a control panel. "You are not in danger," it said, its voice synthesized through a small orb hovering near its neck. "You sustained blunt trauma during atmospheric entry. Standard inversion therapy enhances circulatory recalibration." Dan blinked. "I fell out of the sky and your first move is to hang me upside down like a Halloween decoration." The alien ignored the comment and pressed something that made the restraints hum. Dan's arms were still pinned, but the table began to rotate until he was lying horizontally. His head throbbed. "Name?" the alien asked. "Dan, Zephyr, I'm guessing you're not with NASA?" "No, I am Dr. Yilrex of the Echelon Ward. You are aboard the vessel Argenix 12. We retrieved your escape pod from your planet's upper atmosphere. Your condition was critical. We administered preliminary stabilizers." Dan tried to lift his head but gave up halfway. "How long have I been out?" 17 planetary rotations. Your species' time approximately 17 days. Dan whistled low. "No wonder my back feels like it got hit by a freight train." Dr. Yilrex extended a thin arm toward a tray of instruments. "You are now stable but displaying signs of neurochemical imbalance and muscular rigidity. I will administer a sedation compound to initiate deep rest." Dan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of sedation compound?" "It is non-invasive and tailored to your neural architecture. You will not feel discomfort." Dan glanced at the glimmering syringe-like device in Yilrex's hand. "You sure about that?" "Because last time someone said I wouldn't feel it, I woke up missing a wisdom tooth and half a beard." Yilrex pressed the injector gently against Dan's neck. There was a soft hiss. Dan blinked. "That was it?" "Yes," he chuckled. "I barely felt that." Yilrex stared at him. "You should now be unconscious." Dan raised an eyebrow. Yilrex tapped the injector, checked the display, then looked at Dan again. "You are not unconscious." "Nope, very much awake. Also, I think you just gave me a mild neck breeze." Yilrex turned away and began scanning through a data tablet. "Your neuroreceptors are not responding. This is anomalous." Dan shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot down his side. "Look, if you're trying to knock me out, you might need something stronger. I once got my appendix removed without anesthesia because the doc thought I was already under. I just laid there and sang Sweet Caroline until it was over." Yilrex froze. "Your species tolerates surgery without sedation." No, most people scream. I was just too doped up to care." Yilrex moved to a console and began speaking into a communicator in a language Dan couldn't understand. The lights dimmed, monitors blinked. A secondary alien, shorter and with a bronze hue, appeared on a screen and nodded solemnly. Dan shifted his shoulders. "I'm guessing something about me is weird. You exhibit pharmacological resistance. This is rare. And problematic. Story of my life." Yilrex retrieved another injector, this one with a thicker vial. "This compound is stronger. It should override resistance." Dan exhaled. "All right, round 2. The second injection hissed against his skin. He felt a brief tingle in his ear. "I'm guessing this one was supposed to work too?" "Yes." Still awake. Yilrex's brows furrowed. "Impossible." Dan attempted to sit up and failed. "You're welcome to take my blood and run all the tests you want, but I'm telling you, it's not new. I've had issues with meds since I was a kid. Had to get fillings without Novocaine once. Not pleasant." Yilrex began scanning him again, more urgently this time. Dan's stomach growled. "You got food on this ship. You require nutrients, preferably something that doesn't move on its own." Yilrex gestured to a nearby wall, which slid open to reveal a compartment. A tray floated out, carrying what looked like gelatin cubes and a clear liquid. Dan sniffed the food suspiciously. "This better not be sentient." It is protein-synthesized algae and rehydrated starch, non-sentient, he poked one of the cubes. Tastes like sadness. Yilrex was still monitoring his vitals. Your metabolic rate is increasing, you are healing, but slowly. Well, I did fall from low orbit. I'd be worried if I bounced back in a day. Yilrex turned to him again. You require further treatment, your ribs are fractured, we must stabilize your thoracic cavity. Dan winced. Yeah, I figured something was cracked. Breathing feels like chewing broken glass. Yilrex approached with a scanning wand and ran it across Dan's torso. A display lit up with the internal image, 3 fractured ribs on the left, 1 on the right. We will apply regenerative mesh to encourage ossification. It is non-invasive, Dan nodded. As long as you're not injecting me again, go ahead. Yilrex retrieved a flat, flexible patch and pressed it over Dan's left side. It emitted a low hum. The pain dulled slightly. Dan leaned back. Now that's more like it. Yilrex stared at him. Your tolerance for discomfort is abnormal. Your body resists sedation and your mind remains lucid during traumatic injury. Dan shrugged. I'm from Detroit. We build different. Yilrex didn't respond to that. The door slid open and a tall figure entered, this one wearing armor that shimmered like scales. It paused, looking from Yilrex to Dan. Is this the one? The armored alien asked. Yes, Yilrex replied. Human designation, Dan Zephyr. Pharmacological resistance confirmed. The armored figure approached, scrutinizing Dan. Resistance to sedation compounds is a military interest. Dan raised an eyebrow. I'm not military, I'm a systems engineer. I fix broken satellites and occasionally fall out of the sky when things go wrong. The armored alien tapped a small console on its wrist. You will come with us. I'm still healing, Dan said. You are functional. Barely. I can't even stand up properly. Yilrex stepped forward. He requires at least 9 more of your planetary days to recover. Mobilizing him now could result in further injury. The armored alien paused. He is not to be harmed, but we must understand this resistance. Dan sighed. If you want to study me, fine. But I need a bed and maybe some soap. Yilrex nodded. I will accompany him. The armored alien turned and walked out. Yilrex disengaged the restraints and Dan groaned as he sat upright. Everything ached. His ribs protested. His spine felt like it had been used as a baseball bat. But he was upright. Yilrex handed him a support harness. Wear this, it will assist spinal alignment. Dan strapped it on with a grunt. Feels like a corset, but sure. They walked slowly through the corridor. The lighting was soft, the walls smooth and iridescent. Other aliens passed them, some glancing with curiosity. Dan muttered, I feel like a chimpanzee at a science fair. Yilrex didn't respond. They arrived at a chamber with a reclining chair surrounded by monitors. Dan sat down carefully. The armored alien reappeared, this time with several others. Begin the test, it said. Yilrex connected several leads to Dan's temples and arms. Pain threshold assessment, Yilrex explained. We will simulate mild injury and observe neural responses. Dan grumbled. You guys ever heard of asking nicely? Yilrex tapped a screen. A sudden jolt shot through Dan's thigh. He flinched. That one I felt. The armored alien leaned in. You are not unconscious. Nope, still here. Yilrex tried a second pulse, slightly stronger. Dan grimaced. Okay, now it's just annoying. The armored alien stared. What planet are you from? Earth. You know, the blue one with too many internet opinions. Yilrex turned to the armored figure. His resistance is not absolute, but it is abnormal. Dan leaned back, breathing heavier. You think I enjoy this? I'd love to be knocked out right now. But my body doesn't play along. The tests continued for hours. Minor shocks, pressure points, thermal probes. Dan endured all of it with varying degrees of discomfort, never once unconscious. By the end, sweat dripped down his neck and his hands trembled. Can I rest now? He asked. Yilrex nodded. You have exceeded expectations. Dan closed his eyes. Great. Now wake me when you figure out how to sedate me properly. He drifted into shallow sleep, not from drugs but sheer exhaustion. His dreams were a blur of falling satellites and humming machines. When he awoke, Yilrex was still there, sitting motionless by a monitor. Dan's voice was hoarse. "Any luck?" Yilrex replied. "We are analyzing your endocrine system. It may offer answers." Dan groaned. "You better not be planning to take anything out." "No." "Merely observation." Dan laid back again. His ribs still ached. His muscles twitched from overexertion. But he was alive, and very, very awake. Dan sat hunched on the edge of a low bench, pulling at the corner of the bandage wrapped around his side. The adhesive was stubborn and his fingers weren't cooperating. Yilrex stood nearby, arms folded in an unfamiliar gesture that might have been concern or calculation or both. "I can take it off myself," Dan muttered. "That bandage is infused with microfibers. Unassisted removal could disrupt tissue regeneration." Dan paused, then let his hand fall. "So what? You've got a button that makes it pop off clean." Yilrex touched the panel on the wall. The bandage dissolved like sugar in water, leaving behind only the faint outline of healing skin. Dan tilted his head back and let out a low whistle. "You guys really hate scissors, huh?" Yilrex didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer and ran a scanner over Dan's ribs. The screen showed green pulses moving across a representation of his skeletal structure. "You've regained approximately 48% integrity in the damaged bone segments," Yilrex said. "However, your sleep cycle remains erratic. Kind of hard to sleep when your bed beeps at you every 10 seconds. That is a monitoring function. It ensures oxygen saturation remains optimal." Dan scratched his collarbone. "I didn't say it wasn't useful, just annoying." Yilrex turned toward the corner of the room, retrieving a thin coil that unfurled into what looked like a flexible harness. "This will support your thoracic column and limit strain on the intercostal musculature during ambulation." Dan eyed the thing like it might bite. "Is that alien for brace?" "Yes, brace." Dan lifted his arms, letting Yilrex slip it over his shoulders and around his chest. The material tightened automatically, hugging his torso without pinching. "All right, not bad. Better than the time I had to brace a broken clavicle with duct tape and a belt." Yilrex paused, eyes narrowing. "You used adhesive tape and a clothing fastener to immobilize a skeletal injury." "It was either that or pass out in a minefield. Not my finest hour, but it worked." Yilrex stepped back, silent for a long moment. "You are a civilian who's had a weird life." "That counts, right?" The door hissed open, and a new figure entered, sleeker than the armored one before, with dark metallic skin and gold bands looping its arms. It carried a tablet-like device and moved with the grace of someone used to issuing orders they didn't expect to be questioned. "It didn't introduce itself. Report," the new alien said to Yilrex without looking at Dan. "He remains pharmacologically resistant," Yilrex replied. "All attempts at sedation have failed, neural modulation ineffective, no signs of neurological degradation." The newcomer's eyes flicked to Dan. "You're an anomaly." Dan raised 2 fingers in a lazy salute. "Takes one to know one. We need to understand your brain, full neural mapping." Dan exhaled. "You gonna ask first or just plug something into my skull?" Yilrex answered before the other could. "We require your cooperation." "The mapping process is non-invasive, though it may induce disorientation." Dan rubbed the side of his head. "I've had concussions. Can't be worse than getting hit with a crowbar." The newcomer gestured toward a recessed platform set into the floor. It lit up with a soft blue glow. Dan approached it slowly and sat down, adjusting the brace as he settled into the seat. Yilrex placed a coil around his temples and activated the scanner. The room dimmed. A ring of lights rotated around the ceiling. "Begin cognitive calibration," Yilrex said. The lights shifted frequency. Dan's vision blurred for a moment, then cleared. He felt a mild warmth in the back of his skull. "Do not resist the impulses," Yilrex added. "Wasn't planning on it. Just don't play any elevator music in my head." The scan lasted several minutes. Dan watched the ceiling, trying not to focus on the strange sensation of his thoughts being gently tugged at. like someone flipping through the pages of a worn-out book. When it ended, the scanner retracted and the platform stopped glowing. Yilrex reviewed the data. His neural oscillations are erratic but stable, no indications of artificial enhancement. His resistance appears to be naturally occurring. The gold-banded alien folded its arms. That's not possible. Yilrex didn't look up. It is happening. Dan stood, wobbling slightly before catching himself. So what now? You gonna dissect my brain with a melon baller? No, Yilrex said, but you will be monitored during behavioral simulations. We must understand the limits of your adaptability. Dan rubbed his face. You want me to run an obstacle course or something? Not physical. Situational. The other alien activated a panel on the wall. A section of it dissolved, revealing a chamber on the other side with a glass wall. Inside was a room set up like a small apartment: bed, table, chair, console. You will remain there for one planetary cycle, Yilrex explained. Supplies will be provided, various challenges will be introduced. Dan narrowed his eyes. Challenges like what? Environmental shifts, decision-making tasks. Variable stressors. You're putting me through a stress test. Yes, Dan sighed. All right, but if you're gonna mess with the heat, at least let me keep the blanket. The gold-banded alien turned to Yilrex. Continue observations. Notify me if he breaches expected parameters. It left without another word. Dan stepped into the chamber. The door sealed behind him. The temperature was neutral, the lighting soft. He moved toward the bed, sat down, and leaned back with a groan. Feels like a hotel room designed by IKEA and a quantum physicist. A dispenser on the wall produced a tray with food, this time more textured, resembling something between bread and tofu. Dan poked it with a utensil, then took a cautious bite. Tastes like if drywall had a cousin who tried to be flavorful. An hour passed. Nothing changed. Dan explored the space, finding a small console with puzzles and logic games in a language he didn't recognize. After a few taps, it switched to symbols he could make sense of: numbers, patterns, spatial tests. He rolled his eyes. Sudoku, but make it alien. He completed 3 of the puzzles, then lay back again. The walls shifted slightly, the lighting adjusting without warning. A low hum began in the floor, subtle but persistent. All right, that's new. He stood. The temperature began to rise slowly, not unbearable but enough to make his skin dampen. The hum increased in pitch. Dan walked over to the console and tapped the screen. It didn't respond. Environmental stressor, huh? Let's see how long you can keep this up. By the 3rd hour, the heat was uncomfortable. Dan stripped off the top layer of his coverall and tied it around his waist. He paced the room, sipping the water provided. The lights dimmed briefly, then returned, pulsing slightly. By the 6th hour, the hum had stopped, but the temperature dropped sharply. Dan wrapped himself in the blanket and sat cross-legged on the bed, breathing steadily. Yilrex observed from the control room. He adapts efficiently. Minimal physiological distress. The gold-banded alien appeared again on the monitor. Increase the complexity. Introduce conflicting stimuli. That night cycle, the walls pulsed with low-frequency sounds. The bed stiffened unexpectedly. The water dispenser ceased functioning. The light flickered in random intervals. Dan sat in the corner, wrapped in the blanket, sipping condensation he'd collected in the bowl from the food tray. His eyes were bloodshot, but calm. "You're not gonna break me with a broken heater and a strobe light, guys," he muttered. By the end of the cycle, the room reset. Light stabilized, temperature normalized, food returned. Dan sat at the table, chewing slowly. When the door opened, Yilrex entered alone. "You completed the simulation without measurable distress." Dan leaned back. "I once spent 3 days trapped in a collapsed tunnel with a radio that only picked up whale songs. You think a broken thermostat's gonna crack me?" Yilrex tilted its head. "Your experience catalog is unconventional." "That's a polite way of saying I've had a rough decade." Yilrex moved closer. "Your adaptability is not just physiological, it is behavioral. You improvise within stress conditions rather than resist them." "Doesn't everyone?" No, most species respond with avoidance or aggression. You adapt through normalization. Dan stood, stretching. You're learning something from this, right? I'm not just your lab rat. Yilrex hesitated. We are learning, and not only about you. Dan raised an eyebrow. What else? Yilrex looked at him for a long moment. We are learning where our assumptions have failed. Dan nodded slowly. Good. Because if this was just about poking the weird human, I'd be asking for hazard pay. Yilrex turned toward the door. You may return to your recovery chamber. Further tests have been postponed. Dan followed, limping slightly. Tell your boss I'm flattered by the interest. But next time, just ask me what I've been through. It's faster. Yilrex didn't respond, but as they walked, something in its posture had changed, looser, less rigid. Almost thoughtful, Dan noticed, but he didn't mention it. Dan sat cross-legged on the diagnostic recliner, fidgeting with a small square of stretchable packaging film he'd peeled from a protein bar. He'd folded and unfolded it 37 times. It was the only thing in the room not bolted down or glowing softly. Yilrex stood beside a console, arms tucked behind its back in a posture Dan had learned was neutral but alert. I'm not saying your food's bad, Dan said, folding the square again, but if I eat one more cube of nutrient brick, I'm going to start hallucinating cheeseburgers. You have maintained caloric intake with an acceptable variance, Yilrex said without glancing up. Hallucinations are more likely to result from insufficient sleep than dietary monotony. I'm used to sleeping with industrial fans and half a dozen server alarms going off. This place is too quiet. You ever tried falling asleep in a soundproof room? Feels like you're drowning in silence. The chamber was designed for neural recovery. Acoustic dampening is calibrated to reduce cognitive fatigue. Well, congratulations, it's working too well. My brain's so rested it won't shut off. Yilrex finally turned to him. We could provide a rhythmic audio stream. White noise, perhaps. Dan perked up. You've got white noise. There are over 11,000 sound profiles in the database. All right, Dan said, sitting up straighter. Give me thunderstorm over a tin roof, not too heavy. Just enough to make it feel like I'm home. Yilrex tapped at the console. A soft crackling began, followed by the gentle percussion of distant rain. It filled the room like a warm coat. Dan sighed, letting his shoulders drop. Better. Thanks. Yilrex paused, then approached with a small, circular device. We have concluded your pharmacological resistance stems from atypical liver enzyme activity. Your metabolism neutralizes compounds before they reach systemic effectiveness. Dan rubbed his jaw. So my liver's an overachiever. What's the fix? We will administer a compound inhibitor. It will temporarily suppress specific enzymes, allowing standard sedatives to function. Dan held out his arm. All right, but if I start glowing or grow a second spleen, we're having words. Yilrex applied the injector. This time the sensation was heavier, a slow, deliberate warmth spreading through his veins. You may experience mild disorientation, Yilrex said. Dan's eyes closed, then opened again. He blinked twice, then looked at Yilrex. Still awake. Impossible. Starting to think that word doesn't mean what you think it means. Yilrex scanned him again. Your system is compensating faster than predicted. The inhibitor was expected to reduce enzyme activity by 60%. You've already restored baseline within 12 minutes, Dan shrugged. Told you my body doesn't play by the rules. I once got stung by a jellyfish and just walked it off. Didn't even blister. Yilrex turned away, speaking into a calm orb in its usual language. After a few moments, the orb dimmed. Dan watched it warily. You're not calling in the armored guy again, are you? No, this is a medical matter, not military. Good, I've had enough attention to last me a fiscal quarter. Yilrex didn't reply. Instead, it retrieved a small glass vial from a wall compartment, filled with a translucent blue liquid. We will attempt one final method. This compound is not a sedative. It is a neurosuppressant used for surgical stasis in species with redundant metabolic pathways. Dan raised an eyebrow. Sounds fancy. What's the catch? It must be absorbed subdermally over several minutes. You will feel pressure and possibly auditory distortion. Dan held out his arm again. Let's roll the dice. Yilrex applied a patch to his forearm. It adhered instantly, emitting a low vibration. Dan sat quietly. The hum grew louder until it sounded like wind through a tunnel. His vision blurred at the edges, then cleared. He blinked once, twice, then stood up, still very much awake. Yilrex approached, scanning. Your brainwave activity remains unchanged. Dan tapped his temple. Maybe I'm just wired different. Yilrex stared at him. You are either a singular anomaly or a poorly understood representative of your species. Probably both. I once saw a guy eat a ghost pepper during a snowstorm on a bet. Didn't react. Just kept shoveling his driveway. Yilrex removed the patch. No further chemical attempts will be made. Your system is incompatible with pharmacological sedation. Dan adjusted his brace and shifted his weight. So what now? We adapt. Your recovery will proceed via physical therapy and controlled rest cycles. No artificial assistance. Dan smiled. Finally. Something I understand. Over the next several days, Yilrex led Dan through a regimen that involved balance training on a gravity-variable platform, guided stretching, and monitored exposure to complex multi-sensory environments. Dan stumbled a lot in the beginning, especially when the floor decided to tilt 30 degrees without warning. Can I request a version of this that doesn't try to throw me into the wall? He grunted after one particularly dramatic stumble. We're testing proprioceptive resilience under shifting vector alignment. It's essential. It's also how I dislocated a shoulder once, on a ferry, long story. By the fourth day, he could stay upright through most of the platform's tricks. His breathing had steadied, and the sharp pain in his ribs had dulled to a manageable ache. Yilrex observed without comment, but Dan noticed the alien no longer hovered quite so close, letting him fall if he had to, trusting he'd get up. During a rest period, Dan sat on the edge of the elevated bench, drinking from a cooled hydration pouch. Yilrex stood nearby, reviewing data from the last session. You've been quiet today, Dan said. There is little data to dispute. Dan raised an eyebrow. That's your way of saying I did well. You exceeded projections. Dan leaned back. I'm gonna pretend that's your version of a compliment. Yilrex set the tablet aside. You are the first human we've encountered directly. We assumed your biology would mirror comparative analogs. We were incorrect. Dan tapped the side of the hydration pouch. Yeah, we've got a habit of surprising people. Yilrex studied him. Your species may be more resilient than anticipated, not simply physically but behaviorally. You reframed every setback as a challenge. We don't always get the option to quit. Yilrex hesitated. There is one final assessment, voluntary, no discomfort. Dan tilted his head. Go on. We would like to perform a full biometric echo. A non-invasive scan to record your internal structure for reference. It will help us design future treatments for your species. Dan stood. That's fair. You've been straight with me. Yilrex led him to the scanner, a vertical chamber lined with concentric rings. Dan stepped in, lifted his arms slightly, and held still as the rings activated. The scan took less than a minute. When he stepped out, Yilrex reviewed the results. You have healed. Not fully, but sufficiently. We will arrange your return transport. Dan blinked. Just like that. You are no longer a medical concern, and you have given us more information than we hoped for. Dan scratched the back of his neck. Glad I could be your favorite guinea pig. Yilrex turned to him. You have a unique physiology, but what stood out was not your resistance. It was your willingness, Dan chuckled. You mean the part where I let you poke me with stuff that didn't work? No, the part where you never demanded anything in return. Dan shrugged. You patched me up. I figured the least I could do was be cooperative. Yilrex nodded once. Most patients, regardless of species, do not respond to uncertainty with patience. Dan looked around the room one last time. Well, I've had worse hospital stays. You will be escorted to the docking tier within the hour. A vessel will return you to your planet. Dan extended a hand. Thanks for not cutting me open. Yilrex looked at the hand, then clasped it. The gesture was awkward, unfamiliar, but it held. Dan smiled and turned toward the corridor, limping slightly but upright. Behind him, Yilrex watched in silence, the scanner still humming softly, already recalibrating for a species it had only just begun to understand.